welcome to African Voices platform. My name is Chiwe Chihana, and I'll be your host for this special edition of the show where we're collaborating with Migration Matters Festival. Tonight, we're talking about migrants and Calais, the longer story, the bigger picture. Now, press and media have focused on Calais as a buzzword for coverage of the plight of migrants and refugees in France. How does this link to activities outside of France and the interventions of state and non-state actors? I'm joined tonight by Dr. Sophie Watt, Dr. Amanda Crawley-Jackson, and Eliza Lavego to discuss this subject. Good evening, Sophie, Amanda, and Eliza.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us on African Voices platform today for this special edition where we are partnering with Migration Matters Festival. I'm really excited that you could join us. And just to start with, could you introduce yourselves and your roles, please? I'll start with Sophie.
Yes, my name is Sophie Watt, and I'm a lecturer in French and Francophone Studies at the University of Sheffield. And I specialize in France's colonial and neo-colonial history and the representation of migration.
Thank you so much. And can we have Eliza, please?
Hi, I'm Eliza. I'm a photographer, Franco-Swiss, based in Geneva. And I studied photography in Vevey, in a school of photography, and then at the University of Art in Geneva.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Amanda?
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm a senior lecturer in French and Francophone Studies at the University of Sheffield. I specialise in philosophies of space and contemporary visual arts from France and the French-speaking world. And I have been working on a project for quite some time now entitled Post-Traumatic Landscapes.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much. I'm really excited to have you. I mean, there's so many questions around Calais, the story of migration and refugees, and Migration Matters Festival really is dedicated to shedding light on the plight of refugees, whereas we celebrate arts and culture from minoritized communities. Sophie, I wondered whether you could talk to me first initially about the title of the show today. So we're saying Migrants and Calais, the longer story, the bigger picture. I just wanted to get an overview of where you are at and your colleagues on that.
Yes, so this project looks at migration via the practice of representation and questions the ways in which images of displaced populations can be reconnected to their historical materiality. And the idea behind this is to deconstruct the visual representation of migration in order to trace back the discourses articulated on the topic and that are used to influence the general public's understanding of the question. So the reason why we found that looking at photography and the representation in the context of Calais was particularly interesting is because we realized that the work of done by certain photographer like Eliza Lavego was addressing critically the situation in Calais and was questioning the level of state violence and repression. It's a type of critical approach that is rarely found in mainstream media and that can have an impact on how to think about migration. So I can give you a little example as well about the idea of the longer story and the bigger pictures is that often the work of these photographers disclose the convergence of two sides of French and Francophone history that are rarely joined together: the French immigration policies, the history of French immigration policies, and the history of French foreign interventions, for example. So when we are confronted with the brutal carceral environment of the camp of Calais that at times is reminiscent of a war zone, it is clear that the photographs transcend the artistic discipline of photography to reinscribe the story of refugees in Calais within the neo-colonial and global context in which France plays a major role.
Thank you, Amanda. In that case, then, I would really like to find out from Amanda. Sorry, I said thank you, Amanda. Sorry, thanks, Sophie. But I would really like to bring in Amanda now and just ask what's the role? What role does photography play in representation of refugees in Calais?
Thanks. So I think one of the first things to acknowledge is that actually, photography has a very long and difficult history, and it's inherently bound up with policing, with identification, with knowing. Historically, it really emerged with what in French are known as, les sciences humaines, these disciplines that are all about knowing people. And as Foucault would say, we want to know so as to better control. Photography is inherently caught up with the desire to see and to know. It was very much part of the colonial apparatus. And Ariella Azoulay has written extensively about the problems that inhere in photography and the perception of, the privileged white communities, their privilege, their right to view disaster, to be its spectator. We know that photography is used in the media to sell newspapers, to generate clicks, to generate advertising revenue. Photography is used to propagate tropes, perhaps of displaced peoples as either victims or as threats. And even images which present as ostensibly humanitarian have been used for political ends, I think, and to mobilize political agendas. So when we're dealing with photography, I think we have to be attentive to that history and the ways in which the photographic apparatus is used, but also the impact this has on the people who are being photographed. Now, as Sophie said at the beginning, we have become very interested in the work of artists, including, let's say, Mathieu Pernaut, Kader Attia, Jacqueline Salmon, who are using photography to do the kind of work that Sophie described just now, deconstructing stereotypes, positioning events in broader historical context, but who've also demonstrated a sustained engagement with the places in which they work, rather than following the flashlights of interest. I think we can see a different time engagement in the photographers with whom we're working. I think there's a call to contemplate, to reflect, to interrogate ourselves, to research, rather than to consume images of disaster. And what I see in the work of many of the artists that we engage with is a focus on mirrors, a call to look at ourselves as consumers of images, as white citizens of Northern Europe, and to consider the role we play in the construction of stereotypes as we consume them. There's a very interesting piece of work by Kaya Silverman, who's talked about the need for what she calls heteropathic identification, and I think this is really important. She says that we need to think about work in which, and I'm quoting, an emotional response comes with respect for the other and the realization that the experience of the other is not one's own. And I think that's incredibly important. So I guess that in the conversation with Elisa today, I hope that we're going to speak about some of those practices and the ways in which we negotiate photography as a very problematic medium, but one which perhaps has emancipatory potential when it's used by artists who are critiquing the paradigms of representation, but also by displaced people themselves as they take up that camera.
Okay, thanks a lot, Amanda. So I guess then that dovetails really well into the question that I have for you, Elisa. Why did you choose to document the situation of displaced people and volunteers in Northern Europe in that case? And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your work in Calais. You could unmute yourself.
Yeah. I was invited by the National Center of Art in Paris, CNAP, and Peru, which is an organization with, sorry, I have to look at the translation.
No problem.
And I remake it again because, sorry. Yeah, so I I will restart. I was invited by the CNAP, the National Center of Art in Paris, and the Peru Center for the Exploration of Urban Resources to make a photographic project in the area of Calais. So I was not, and it was in 2016, I was not I had not to do something on the jungle of Calais, but I decided to work there because I had already done a lot of work on borders, and it was I was really interested in focusing on this problematic and on this area. Although before having this command, I would not dare really. I was not brave enough to start a project there, also because I felt it was not really my role as also, like you said, Amanda, as a white and living comfortably in Switzerland with my papers, allowing me to travel around the world, almost everywhere. To make a project there was quite tough, and I wouldn't dare before, also because I had seen so many images before in the media, but also in artistic projects. I felt like it was not necessary, really, in a way. But with this command, I started also listening broadcast radio, and I heard a lot of volunteers speaking, and I thought to myself, but I've never really seen images of them. That's quite strange in the media, but also in artistic projects. So I decided quite quickly to focus on them and on their relation to displaced people and on the friendship they could make together, because they were not, for most of them, they were not living in the jungle, but they would come every day and helping them and making food together and everything. So
right.
yeah.
So really the positive story of that environment totally being missed by the media, and you thought, let me capitalize on this and actually relate, as it's because what you're showcasing is actually relationships that have been built in that space, right?
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because most of the people there volunteer were English people, actually, and I felt it was really interesting to see that because at least in the organization where I went, and I think, yeah, mostly it was more people from the UK than French people coming to be volunteer.
Okay, thank you. And Sophie, could you give us a bit more background then, information about the situation in Calais itself since the jungle was first formed? And where are the people in Calais from? I know you were saying something about Francophone France, and I think I'm trying to interrogate a little more about that.
Mm-hmm. So Calais, as a camp for refugees, has taken many different forms over the years, and we can identify about 4 different phases. The first being what is called Sangatte in the 1990s, which was a warehouse owned by Eurotunnel and transformed into a humanitarian emergency accommodation and reception center, and renamed Sangatte after the seaside town there. And it was open to refugees coming from or fleeing conflict erupting from the dissolution of former Yugoslavia, and that led to forced displacement. So the first wave of refugees arrived in France in 1999, in the mid-90s and the late 90s. And this center wasn't left open very long. It was closed in 2002 by Nicolas Sarkozy and David Blanket. And often some analyses have reminded us that the reason why Sangatte was closed is that because migration was becoming too visible in France at the time. So the second phase between 2002 and 2009 is really the phase where the jungle, as we know it, or as we understand it, was built. And it started really in the woods of Bois de Garenne, where mainly Afghan refugees started building sites and settlements there. It comes after the aggravation really of the Afghan conflict between 2004 and 2005, and it leads to a large number of refugees arriving in this area. And as we go on, we can see that around 2007 and 2008, the British and French authorities get together to organize raids in the camp in order to capture the Afghan refugees and to deport them back home. They had planned different flights, for example, for them to be returned to Afghanistan. So it's quite the level of brutality and the level of the militarization of the area is becoming more and more pressing at the time. And it reaches the moment of the dismantlement of the jungle in 2009, and that moment is heavily mediatized by the French government because they wanted to justify the dismantlement of the jungle. It's also really the moment where in the media you've got this linguistic shift between the use of the term refugee and the use of the term migrant that is quite interesting because, for example, the Geneva Convention has a much broader understanding of refugee. That is, anybody persecuted is a refugee, but with the term migrant, you've got this closed down on the terminology used. Almost symbolically, that status is refused to the people arriving on French soil. So the third phase from 2009 and 2016.
Something, can I just check? So when you say that, you say that to mean it means that if you're seeking asylum, then almost automatically your rights in that space are sort of dampened down. You can't ask for asylum because it's just migrants rather than refugees. Is that what you're relaying?
Yeah, it's assumed that you haven't been granted the right of asylum. By using the term migrant, it is assumed you don't have the status of a refugee. So symbolically speaking, it doesn't put you in the same space. And it also, I think that it also is quite useful to be used by the government because the state has duties towards refugees, whereas the duties are not clearly stated towards migrant populations. So that linguistic shift, although symbolic, is actually in reality extremely brutal, I think.
Right.
So yeah, if you just if we want to understand the what's happening after 2009, it's really interesting because there's, of course, the people can't go anywhere. The camp is dismantled, but some of them are placed in retention centers. Some of them are pushed back to the other camps in the north of France around Dunkirk, who are known for the level of brutality and militarization as well. And what we see happening is a proliferation of little jungles set up in the Mistral, Dunkirk, and the northern coast, and also some in Paris as well. There's some settlements that arrive in Paris at the time. And again, the dismantlement of these little jungle progressively is organized by the state between 2015 and 2016, where the second wave of refugee arrived from other conflicts, like in Eritrea, in Somalia, and in Syria, with the beginning of the US airstrikes on civilians. So as of 2016, it's just basically a constant movement of construction and destruction of settlements, a never-ending process of trying to settle somewhere and being chased by the authorities. So it's interesting to see that this practice doesn't just happen in Calais. This exactly the same practice of weekly basis disturbances and dismantlements happen in the camp of, for example, Aubervilliers, Porte d'Aubervilliers, or Porte de la Chapelle in the periphery of Paris. And these attacks are extremely brutal and heavily militarized as well.
I kind of want to stay with you on that, Sophie, because this also, I think many will be surprised to hear a lot more detail around what's actually happening, because the media has actually gone a bit more silent about them. What's going on with that end of things? Why do we not see these stories anymore?
I'm not sure why it's not in the media, probably because of the situation related to COVID. Very little images came out because of the COVID situation. There was a dismantlement of a camp in Calais last week. A few hundred refugees were placed in centers. There were about 30 children as well. And to give you an idea, in order to remove these amount of people, they sent 300 police forces. So it's just to give you the idea of the scale of the militarization that is organized in order to contain these population at the moment.
Right, thank you. It sounds really traumatic, and that kind of speaks a little bit to your exhibition at Graves Gallery in Sheffield, Amanda. So this festival is based in Sheffield and obviously really related. So you had this exhibition called Invisible Wounds, and that explored the representation of post-traumatic landscapes in contemporary photography. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that, and to what extent you consider the camps in Northern Europe post-traumatic landscapes?
Yes. So, as you said, the exhibition Invisible Wounds happened at the Graves Gallery in 2020. It wasn't open for very long. It had to close because of COVID, but I selected a number of Elisa's photographs for that exhibition. I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is that, you know, the very term post-traumatic is an oxymoron, because chronologically it suggests that trauma was in the past. But of course, we speak of post-traumatic when trauma remains live in the present. And what I wanted to show through the exhibition was how the present and landscapes of the present have been constructed in violence, even if that violence has been visually or discursively erased. So I was looking at landscapes of past trauma where that trauma remains live, even if it's not visible, but also landscapes of re-traumatization. And I think that's incredibly important when you're speaking about Calais, because for me, post-trauma speaks to some of the complexity of the time of trauma. Individuals and communities carry trauma through time and space. People who find themselves in Calais are bringing with them traumas experienced elsewhere that are not in the past, but which are continually experienced in the present. And through their constitution as migrants, as Sophie has just described, they're subject to a re-brutalization, a re-traumatization. So there are multiple layers and multiple times of traumas that I guess I was trying to address through the work of some of the photographers whose work I showed. I think that in terms of photography, there's a real challenge there, because photography is an inherently visual medium. And I think many of the photographers are thinking in their work about how to show what is perhaps not visible or no longer visible. How do you show the structures that have created the camps in Calais? How do you point to traumatizing histories that people who find themselves in Calais have lived through, but which are not visible in the space of Calais. How can photography account for the absences, the erasures, the repressed, the unspoken? And I think also, you know, photography operates in the mode of a single frame. How can photography deal with the longer story, the bigger picture? How can it show the political and structural forces that shape the traumatizing and the re-traumatizing present? So I think through the curation, I tried to bring out some of the historical connections through the selection of photographs and the organization of photographs in the exhibition space. And Elisa's work, for example, was shown next to photographs by Simon Norfolk, and they were of the secondary mass graves in Bosnia. And Sophie's already described how conflict in the former Yugoslavia really led to mass forced displacement and the arrival in France of refugees. And, you know, through the war in Kosovo, for example, we see this kind of intensification of displacement. And what I wanted to do through the curation was show some of the connections between Elisa's work and other places. Next to Simon Norfolk's works on Bosnia, I showed works by a French-Brazilian photographer, Roberto Frankenberg, who in his photographs traced the routes followed by his grandparents as they were sent to the concentration camps in Eastern Europe during the Second World War. And it was actually the kind of the erasure of atrocities in the Second World War and the trials at Nuremberg that actually prompted the creation of the secondary mass graves in Bosnia, when perpetrators decided to try to conceal the evidence of their crimes and those atrocities so that they could not be prosecuted as perpetrators had been at Nuremberg. So in that space, I was trying to talk about erasure, about connections, about the continuation of practices, you know, of violence. And I guess it was in this context that I really tried to kind of demonstrate how Elisa's work is about symptoms, it's about phantoms, it's about reading the landscape in a more attentive way, trying to determine what is outside the frame, as well as seeing what is within the frame. And that requires patient historical research. It requires looking at a broader ecology of images. I think it means engaging with historical research, which is perhaps, you know, beyond the immediate context of Calais, if we're to understand the trauma that inheres in Calais in the present.
Yeah. I was wondering actually, because as part of Migration Matters Festival, there's also an installation of Elisa's work as well, alongside, I think you've co-curated this, Amanda, if I'm not mistaken. Did you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Or was that you, Sophie, that co-created this work? We've got an online exhibition, or which is Calais in and out of focus, representations of migration in France.
Yes, Amanda and I co-curated the exhibition, and we tried to organize Elisa's pictures in a way that they could dialogue within each other from different part of the room. So, for example, there's a very interesting connection between the photograph of the bunker of the Second World War and the photograph of the, in a way, the neo-colonial bunker, the container, and the container camp that was created in 2016 inside the Camp de la Lande. So it's almost like it was a camp within the camp with biometric security and fingerprints detection to regulate the entrance of the camp, but of course with no access to water. So it was really important to create that type of dialogues between the photographs that we put together. And Amanda is an expert in curating these type of exhibitions, so I'm sure she'll have more to say about it.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Sophie. Go ahead, Amanda, and then I need to speak to you a little bit, Elisa.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, curation is about creating linkages, connections, continuities and juxtapositions that actually raise questions rather than providing some of the answers. I'd like people to spend time in an exhibition and to think of what can be seen, but also what can't be seen. Reading between the lines. I mean, you know, Invisible Wounds was a group show and it involved a number of photographers. Elisa's show, Migration Matters, is a solo show of her work. But what we were able to do was show some of her work from other places in France. And I think we wanted to kind of contextualize Calais, because as you said at the very beginning, you know, there's been a spotlight on Calais. It's become, sorry, a buzzword for migration. It's become a symbol, which I think people assume can be easily interpreted. We know what Calais is, we know what Calais looks like, we've seen so many images. And I think by constellating Elisa's work in different places, we're able to interrogate some of the broader practices of containment, which perhaps we weren't able to do in Invisible Wounds. So, and yeah, and I'm sure Elisa will be able to tell us much more about what's in the exhibition and how she envisages the connections between those works.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. And yes, Elisa, I would really like to hear more from you about this particular exhibition.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It was. Yeah, it was really nice because I had not to curate the work. Sophie and Amanda did it for me, so it was great to have this surprise, and it's my first experience also to do it virtual. But it's interesting because it's another it's another thing than in real place, real gallery. But I'm really happy to still have the impression to enter space thanks to this 3D virtual gallery. And it was interesting to see how they would curate this work for me. And so it was really nice also. For me, it's the first time I show this photographic work of Calais with these new works I did recently in Lyon and Briançon. And it's interesting to see these works together.
Yeah, good stuff. And so why did you see the need to do that extra work out beyond Calais, like you said in Lyon? Why did you feel like you needed to look outside of Calais? And what's the difference in that experience?
When I worked in Calais, it was very brief because I started in the summer of 2016, and then they dismantled the camp in October 2016. And so, I mean, I had not really the time to really have a concept. I mean, I knew I wanted to work on relation between volunteers and refugees, but it was too short for me to really express and to make a bigger work on these relations. And so later in 2019, because I heard also through media and also through friends of mine of Briançon, the situation in Briançon. And then after also different places, because I have friends living in France, I realized that there was this network of small organization and sorry, I will look on my notes. Is it okay if you have to cut? Or?
I can.
Yes, so I realized there was this network of solidarity all over France, and in many cities, also villages. And so I wanted to show this network because it was a mobilization from the citizen to, because of a lack of welcoming infrastructures from the French government, but it's the same in many places in Europe, I mean. But so it was really impressive for me to see how everywhere people would help and give their time to welcome and to give a shelter, or to help with French, or to help with trying to ask asylum and everything.
Great, lovely, thank you. Now, this is a bit one of maybe a tougher question for all the three of you that I'm going to ask now. It's more around, we talked earlier about the portrayal and the power dynamics between white persons and the relationship with Calais. How do you feel that relationship translates when you're working with refugees, for example, like Elisa's work? What's the relationship, relationship dynamic between Elisa, not just with the volunteers, but with the refugees themselves whose portraits have been taken? Any one of you can take that.
Shall I begin? Is that okay?
Go ahead, yeah.
So I think this is perhaps, the most important question. And we know that there are hundreds of thousands of images online of displaced people in Calais. And most of those photographs are produced by white photographers, white aid workers, and it's actually incredibly hard to find works by displaced people in Calais. This I'm always aware that this is perhaps because I don't speak Farsi or Arabic. I can't find those images online. So I know that my perspective is skewed by my own linguistic constraints, for example. I also know that I've chosen not to go to Calais, actually, and to focus on the ways in which it's represented. I think whiteness, of course, absolutely comes into play here, because if we're thinking about decolonizing the lens, it's incredibly important to reflect on our own whiteness as producers of images and as consumers of images. I think there are other issues we should be mindful of, such as what is shown and the conditions of production. So, displaced people in Calais, we know that they have problems accessing Wi-Fi and phone charging. It's not as easy to make images, and it's certainly not as easy to share those images. The Dublin Agreement will often mean that people don't want to be represented in France or in the so-called jungle of Calais, because that might impact on their asylum status when they come to the UK. We know also that many people don't want to be photographed. They don't want their families to see them living in the jungle. They don't want to be seen in conditions of distress, for example, and that impacts absolutely on image production by displaced peoples. I think one of the things that interests me also is that I've seen in a number of projects reflection on the kinds of images that displaced peoples might be asked to produce in an act of participation or collaboration. And artists such as Ito Barada, who comes from Morocco, did a series of works with displaced peoples in North Africa and in Marseille. And actually what the young people, the displaced people, wanted to show was not the life in which they are living, but the life they would like to live. And, you know, in a certain way, the work became a work of aspiration. It was a dream work. They wanted to demonstrate their aspirations and not the conditions in which they found themselves. Now, I think that unless we take all of this on board, we're risking a perception how can I put this, where we're putting ourselves at risk of universalizing interpretation. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. And in my work, I try to be very attentive to the conditions of production and dissemination, and always to be mindful actually that what I see in these photographs is not Calais. It's not the displaced peoples. I'm seeing a representation that my encounter with that reality is always mediated, and it's mediated through that frame. Now, I think what is emancipatory about this practice, however, is it can become a space of dialogue. And I think that is really important. Ariella Azoulay has talked about the capacity of photography to develop relations of partnership. And Zia Gafic, who works near Sarajevo actually, and with the International Organization for Migration, a number of photographers, has made the point that I think we try to be very mindful of, that everything we know about people on the move and their precarious journey is told from the perspective of outsiders. Okay, and that's a quote. And I think that's incredibly important. And we might perhaps move on to this. I don't want to get into another question without having been asked it, but I think we do need to talk about production of images by displaced peoples, what that might look like, what the dangers are there, I think.
Absolutely.
And what
I think,
is.
yeah, no, absolutely. You're totally right, because I think the question that I was going to ask subsequent to that again was also around, it's that that conflict between security and visibility and taking ownership of your own narrative. So I was actually going to ask you, you've probably answered a little bit of that, but I was going to say, but how do you envision that the narrative of migrants can be strengthened from their accounts and perspectives, whilst also retaining this security aspects, a safer existence, I suppose, in those precarious circumstances? I don't know if that's something you would speak to as well.
Well,
Sophie, go.
No, I just wanted to come back onto the conditions that have been imposed in France and also at a European level when talking about the establishments of this security praxis, this European security praxis. I mean, between 2003 and 2004, there's a series of practices and measures that have been implemented in order to optimize surveillance and containment of these migrant populations. You've got this juxtaposed border control that was established with the Treaty of Touquet in 2003, but there's the first biometric data collection with Eurodac in 2003 as well, where all the fingerprints of migrants are collected as soon as they pass illegally a border within Europe. And of course, we often refer to borders in Europe as being a free movement of people because of this notion of Europe, but they're not for the migrant populations because of the Dublin's agreements. People have to seek asylum in the first country they land in, and that was implemented from 2003 and 2007. So, and I think there's also the launching of Frontex, this European border agency that is more and more becoming like a European police border, and gradually undertake a number of activities such as deportation of migrants and pushbacks as well of migrants at European borders. And it is planned that these agents are going to be able to work in third countries as well, where in the countries where the migrants are for. So it's becoming more and more difficult for these people to have any possibilities of liberty of movement, but also liberty of documenting their journey and their lives. In France, there's also quite an important law that is called or is renamed the solidarity offense, that basically stop people from helping the refugees. And in 2003 up until 2010, there's a promulgation of heavier sentences for whoever charges phones for them, for example, or give them food or help them in any way, shape and forms. I mean, these measures have been tempered since 2012, and because there were some very mediatized trials of people being charged with criminal offenses for helping them. So I think it's important to realize that the level of agency for these people is more and more restricted as we go on the history of these settlements. And what I find interesting, for example, with the photographers and we're studying, and Elisa in particular, is that they managed to create a space for dialogue with the people they have worked with to create these photographs. If you look at some of the photographs taken by Elisa of Aminata, the one you've chosen, for example, or Ibrahim or Ahmed, there's a real exchange that is happening in the photograph. There's almost the space for them to recreate a persona, for example, with Ibrahim and the butterfly mask. And I think it goes beyond a certain form of counter discourse. It really allows for these refugees to have a space to dialogue and to express themselves. And I think that was what struck me the most with Elisa's photographs. And when I teach this material in my classes, often students are amazed when they see the portraitures, for example, because they can really understand the dynamic that happened between the photographers and the people being photographed. So that part, I think, that is particularly interesting.
Thank you so much, both Amanda and Sophie, for that sort of response. I think it definitely is a very complex situation where you can't really. A pathway is a challenge right now to really think of. But for our viewers out there, the exhibition we're discussing is part of Migration Matters Festival, and it's labeled Calais, In and Out of Focus, Representations of Migration in France. That's on the Migration Matters Festival website, running from up to the 20th of June. So please, if you could just go and have a look and interact with these images that we're actually discussing at the moment. Elisa, that brings me back to you. I'm wondering what your plans are. So what are you working on at the moment, and which projects do you have in the pipeline that people should look out for? You're muted, Elisa.
Okay. I will, if it's okay for you, I can also go back on how I work with displaced people in Calais, for example.
I'd appreciate that if you're okay with that. Yes.
Yeah. And with volunteers also. So it was interesting because when I asked volunteers to make a photograph of them, they would be kind of surprised because they had not been used to, and were kind of like, why? Or they felt it was kind of strange. And with refugees in Calais, at the beginning I was more focused on landscape because kind of wouldn't dare to ask. And then sometimes it was actually people living in the jungle who would ask me to be photographed. And I think there is a part of them that want to be seen also, because they are always seen as a group, but in the media, through media, and like something that could be scary because they are only seen as numbers, you know, often numbers, group. And so some of them would ask me to be photographed. And so more and more I was asking and finding people who would be happy to be photographed. But it was also through meeting people. I had time to meet them, to talk to them, and always I would add them their Facebook or email to send them back the photograph. Also, sometimes some refugees would not have liked to be photographed alone, but with friend of them who was a volunteer, they would be okay. Because yeah, when I asked, also my concept was to also ask volunteer or refugees to be photographed with a friend of them, not someone they just met. And so yeah, one time one of the volunteer and the refugee I photographed, the refugee just had been allowed to, he had asylum in France, so he was going to leave the jungle, and they said to me, oh, we wanted to have a photograph of us together, so he could put this photograph on his fridge. So they were very happy to have me doing this photograph. So yeah, it was also through this meeting, and for me it was important to give them back something, if I could, at least a photograph through internet. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're
That's
welcome.
very insightful. Yeah, and yeah, if you could speak to the other thing, I'm really interested. I'm sure a lot of people are more interested about your plans. What next for you?
Yeah. So yeah, as I said, I decided to go on this project, to continue it, but in different area in France. So I went to Briançon and Lyon, and I want to go also to other parts in France, to show this network of to show this network of solidarity. And so, but every place is different, has a different situation, political situation and everything. So in Briançon is near the border with Italy, and it has been quite mediatized through media in France, at least, because the refugees are trying to cross the border through Italy in the mountains during the night. And so in winter it can be very dangerous, and there had been several people who died, unfortunately, trying to cross and to reach France, because there is a lot of surveys in this border, and so policemen tried to catch them, so they would run and then find them completely lost in the mountain. And so there were so many very sad stories there. And what I photographed there in a place run up by volunteers, and there is also marauders who are going every night during the winter to try to find if there is people trying to reach France, if there is refugees trying to cross the border, if they can help them. Sorry?
Is Mahouda military? I'm sorry, I missed that.
I know. I don't know, we didn't find a translation, no? Amanda, you said we can say it in English, or?
The marauders would be, yeah, the closest word.
All right, okay, yeah, thank you for that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's also volunteers, but it's they are giving times by trying to find the refugees before the policeman could find them, and trying to give them, to bring them back to France in a safe place, and going to the doctor if they need, because a lot of them are, it's very cold in the winter. Sometimes they are arriving not really prepared to that. So that's another kind of people giving their time there. And in Lyon, I worked in a squat because in many cities in France, there is no infrastructures to give a shelter to people asking asylum, to give a place, I mean. And so many militants are opening squats to give a place to refugees, often also minors who have no place to stay. And so it's another type of citizen mobilization that I wanted to show.
That sounds really amazing, really, really great. Thank you, Elisa, and really looking forward to a lot of that, seeing a lot of that. Amanda, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on a festival such as Migration Matters Festival and what it does for this kind of art and creating that space. Anything you would speak to? These spaces are rare, but I do think that there's something that's got to be said, I think, from your perspective on that.
Sure. I think I'd just like to pick up on something Sophie said, actually, because for me, the real benefit is creating a space of dialogue and reflection. And I think the kind of multimodal nature of the festival is really important. It gives people a chance to engage with, different spaces of reflection, to engage in different conversations, and to put some of those pieces together, to come to conversations, having seen Elisa's exhibition, to be able to meet the artist, so I think that is incredibly important. I'd say as well that, what festivals such as Migration Matters do is they create a space for dialogue, reflection, but also self-reflection. I think it's incredibly important that we continue to self-reflect and to challenge our own practices of thinking and working, and to do that in dialogue with others is so important. Meanings, I think, are co-constructed, reviewed, contested. The stakes of those meanings are constantly renegotiated. So I think it's incredibly important. I don't want to speak on Elisa's behalf, but I think to show Elisa's work in the context of this festival is incredibly important, because it does some of that work of the contextualization that we've spoken of before, that enable a kind of more profound reading of those works, to hear the opinions of others. So I think it's an incredibly important event. And I think also it's a regular event. I think that's really important. Like the photographers who work we engage with, it's important that these discussions don't just take place once and then disappear and fall off the map. It's got to be sustained. I think the conversations we're having have to be reviewed in the light of evolving geopolitics, for example, in the context of Brexit more recently, and the festival gives us a space in which to kind of evaluate the work that we're all doing. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Now that you've touched on Brexit, when Elisa was speaking and she was talking about these images of grouped together migrants and refugees, asylum seekers that we saw, I think those ones did a lot of damage to relationships between the migrant community, whether third generation, first generation, fourth, with host communities here in Europe. So you're absolutely right to touch on that. So those conversations need to be ongoing. Thank you. Sophie, I think I have so many questions for you, but maybe the important one to close off with is you telling me why you felt it was important to document the bigger picture, a longer story about the representation of Calais in the media and photography.
Well, according to Loïc Vacant and his sociological study, the punitive nature of the neoliberal order and the normalization of this series of penal institutions is doubled by a profound discrimination against its targets. And I think Vacon argues that despite the rise of corporate criminality since the 1990s, only the lowest classes of society experience a direct consequence of this punitive turn. And I think clearly the analysis of Vacon can be extended to refugees. This socio-ethnic selectivity is the result of state crafting that represent a pillar of the neoliberal order, and that is clearly legalized via heavy bureaucratic system and justified via some media coverage that are done very quickly and without asking people's permission and to generate these type of stereotypes and emotional discourses that we've been talking about. So I think the mechanisms and apparatus of oppression need to be exposed, and they need to be taught in the classroom and outside the classroom. As Amanda was saying, these discussions need to happen, and because they're usually normalized by the media, who use often a very emotional discourse based on fears and exaggerations as well. You know, we're talking about Calais and this immense crisis in France and in Europe. But I mean, before the First World War, 55 million of Europeans crossed the Atlantic. 12,000 people arrived on a daily basis in Ellis Island. You know, migration is something that has been a normal phenomenon as well, that has happened over the centuries. So we need to be able to recontextualize what is happening in Calais. So I think using artistic productions such as Elisa's work or other photographers in order to engage in these discussions, to deconstruct these stereotypes and these discourses that are, you know, often portrayed as being the truth over this migration crisis is very important and essential to be done with the students, with the general public, and to have more opportunities to discuss these issues. So that's why I think it's essential to showcase this kind of artistic production.
Absolutely, really thankful. I mean, there's so many angles this conversation could actually go on. There's so much I wanted to unpick, unpack, and thanks so much for all the knowledge you've shared, and also just your talent, Elisa. That's really inspiring that you can bring these stories to the fore, and we can talk about it from a different narrative than what mainstream media would actually have us want to discuss it on. And so just to say thank you very much, Dr. Sophie Watt, Dr. Amanda Crowley-Jackson, and Elisa Lavego for joining us today for this episode of Migration Matters Festival. And we will continue to have these conversations. There's also an installation by Elisa that everybody can actually experience still right up to the end of the festival. Good night, and thanks so much for joining us.